And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome back to the TeachThought podcast. If you're a return listener, and if you're a new listener, thanks for joining us. If you like what you hear, we'd be flattered if you would share it with your network and recommend us and review us. As vaccines and the COVID cloud, or the light at the end of that tunnel, seems to be somewhat nearer and perhaps imminent, I want to remind folks that we are still offering workshops and services online and doing that in personalized and innovative ways, as well as looking toward the future and hopefully soon in-person and on-site workshops similar to those that we were doing before COVID-19 hit us about a year or so ago. So if you are interested in our services, please visit wegrowteachers.com and navigate around project-based learning, differentiation, inquiry, growth mindset, lots of things that we can help with, but we'd love to help you if you are so inclined. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, drew@teachthought.com. In this episode, I spoke with Emma Brown, who is an author and reporter for the Washington Post, and as you'll hear, you may know her work most famously for breaking the story with Christine Blasey Ford and Justice Kavanaugh. What we talked about in this episode was her book called To Raise a Boy, which deals with many of the facets and the complexities and nuances of boys and malehood and the culture around boys and raising boys. So we talked about a lot of those pieces, as you might imagine, and certainly an interesting conversation and hopefully useful as you think about parenting, but teaching and the role of teachers and education in thinking about the complexities and nuances of this issue. So I hope it's helpful. All right, we're officially live, and I'd like to welcome our listeners to the podcast and officially welcome Emma Brown to the podcast and give you an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself, so that folks know who they're listening to. You certainly have a bit of a profile. I'm sure you're well aware of that, as you have broken some interesting stories in the past for the Washington Post, but you have a new book called To Raise a Boy. But yeah, give us a little bit of your, your elevator pitch, or who you are and what drives you.
Great. Well, relevant to your audience, I'm a former middle school math teacher and came to journalism a little bit late. I have been at the Washington Post for the last decade or so, and I'm on our investigative team now. So you referenced a profile of the story that I wrote that your listeners might know about is I wrote the story in which Christine Blasey Ford first came forward to say that she had been sexually assaulted by Brett Kavanaugh. And so that is part of the reason part of what led me to write this book. But really, it goes back to when my son was born. He was 6 weeks old, and I was home on maternity leave when the first Harvey Weinstein stories broke. And so I was nursing him and scrolling through my phone, reading that story, and then all the stories that came after that fall. Made me think in ways I hadn't thought before about how am I going to raise my son to be different? I mean, I have an older daughter. She's 3 years older. When she was born, I had just really strong instincts about how to parent her, to resist the messages that get beamed at girls from the time they're tiny. But I realized I just didn't have those instincts for my son because I didn't know what it was like to be a boy. And frankly, I think I thought boys had it easier. And what I learned through my research for this book, so I traveled around the country. I talked to coaches and teachers and researchers and boys and their parents, is that that's a really oversimplified and not accurate way to see things.
So raising kids is complex. What?
I know. And boys face this set of really strong pressures that are not super healthy for them, not healthy for the people around them. So, this book is about what it's like to grow up as a boy in America right now, and what we can all do differently and better, hopefully, to support boys, help them learn the skills they need to have strong relationships.
Right. And how old, just for the record, how old are your kids?
They are now 3 and 6. So
Okay.
my younger son is 3 and my daughter's 6.
All right. So this is an interesting book and an interesting conversation to have, because obviously I was a boy, I'm a male, and I have 2 daughters. One is 12 and one about to turn 14. And I find some analogs in some of the pieces that you write about, and some things that certainly resonate, and then also some questions. And so as it's informed, like I think about raising daughters as certainly one of the things that you mentioned that strikes me as interesting. And I have friends who had, like, one in particular has 2 boys and then had a daughter, and he always sort of jokingly says, but I think pretty seriously, kind of similar to you in some ways, like, I don't know how to raise a daughter. Like, I wasn't ever a daughter, so how, what do I know here? And it always strikes me as odd, like, and it makes sense. Don't get me wrong. What you're saying it's not like, well, that's stupid or anything like that. But like, I didn't. People say, well, didn't you want a boy? And I go, I wanted healthy children and wonderful children, and all those things. Whether they're a boy or girl wasn't really interesting to me, particularly interesting. And I don't raise them, or I try not to raise them as a girl, quote unquote, as I think some of the things that resonate in your book. And I do think it's important to notice and recognize some of the cultural pieces around maleness and boys and some of the complexities there. And that's not to discount some of the things around girls, but it kind of feels like you're getting ahead of some of the maybe criticism that you, I'm sure, have gotten anyways, with the first chapter, which is the invisible epidemic of sexual assault against boys. And maybe I'm wrong there. And to listeners, there is some language in this book, and maybe we'll use some of that language in this book that is, like, who the first part, who boys don't ask for help or don't be a pussy. Like, woo, well, okay, there we are, right? So was that a little bit of a trying to get ahead of some of the criticism that you might have gotten, or probably still you actually get?
No, I didn't construct my book around anticipated criticism.
Okay.
I started the book with that chapter because it was one of the most profoundly disturbing and transformative part of my reporting, to learn about the problem of sexual victimization of boys. And it really, for me, forced me to sort of reckon with the fact that I, however enlightened I think I am, I was carrying around some assumptions about boys and some stereotypes. And so what I mean by that is, I think the conversation around sexual violence tends to focus on sexual violence against girls and women because it is more common. But it's still such a problem for boys. As many as 1 in 6 boys are sexually assaulted before he turns 18. And it's not something, when we do talk about it, we tend to talk about it in terms of like the Catholic Church or Boy Scouts of America, these scandals involving older men preying on younger boys, which certainly does happen. But I think what I learned in the course of this reporting is also that women can prey on boys, and peers can hurt one another, and that boys and girls can hurt boys. But I think so. I write in the book about a few examples of what's sometimes called hazing, but is actually sexual assault or rape. Penetration of boys by other boys on their teams as a way of showing dominance, and one in particular. So there's a middle school boy in Oklahoma who showed up to his new school, and in front of his entire music class, when his teacher was out of the room, a couple of his football teammates sexually assaulted him. And when he went to go tell his principal, it later came out, because this turned into a criminal investigation and then a civil lawsuit. The principal told investigators, had the same thing happen to a girl, I would have seen it as a sexual assault, but because it was boys, it was horseplay. And so it's just such a striking example to me of how we see boys differently than girls. We treat their their experiences and their pain perhaps differently than girls. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because what support we get after something like that happens depends on how we think about it as adults. So I started this book this way because I think we have to sort of reckon with how we view boys and how we treat their bodies if we're going to be sort of talking to them, to boys, about how we want them to treat other people's bodies, and in particular girls and women. We have to sort of value boys' bodies and tell them and believe that their bodies are sacred in the same way that we tell girls and believe that their bodies are sacred.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the things around honor culture, and I find to be a little perplexing as I navigate. I mean, I'm 51, so I've navigated the world for 51 years in some ways, in many ways, obviously, as a male. And sort of that culture, that honor culture, boys don't cry. You know, there's a veneer that you put up that you're not supposed to have any of those emotions. You know, the idea that, you know, we're not supposed to, as males, express some of the emotions. The only real emotion that we're supposed to express is anger, right? Or that's one of the main acceptable ones, whereas females are more, not supposed to express anger, but are more aligned or culturally acceptable to express other ones. And I find that to be just really perplexing. You know, I was a coach. I played some sports in school. I coached girls basketball. I coached boys golf. I've coached my daughter in soccer. And I think you played soccer in how far did you advance in your soccer career?
I played through high school.
Okay.
I didn't play in college.
Yeah, so I've got my youngest daughter is playing club soccer, and you know, it's just a great opportunity for her to develop some of the lots of skills and things. But you know, did you see some connections to that honor culture? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so I use a different term in the book. So I don't use the term toxic masculinity, which is sometimes what that's called, right? Because what boys told me was they heard that hear that term as an attack on boys or an attack on masculinity. So and one boy said to me, a high school student said, you know, if you use that term, no one's going to hear anything you say. So I write in the book about pressures that boys feel or stereotypes that boys feel, or sometimes the man box, which is a term that men who are trying to sort of broaden ideas about masculinity have used for a long time. But the idea that boys are supposed to sort of do whatever it takes to not be girly is a really strong idea in our culture. And that, you know, sometimes that means like, oh, don't wear pink or don't paint your fingernails. But more importantly, it means don't, acknowledge and express your emotions.
Right.
And that is the part that I think can be really destructive for boys. So there's research, that shows that boys who really feel like they have to live up to those restrictive ideas face more health problems later on, more physical health problems, more trouble seeking help for mental health issues. And men in our country end up dying by suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of women. So like these ideas that we give boys about having to be always strong and not ask for help. Those are, I mean, I want my daughter to be strong, certainly, but I also want both my kids to be able to ask for help and reach out and emote. So I want them both to have access to sort of the full range of humanity, whether we call that masculine or call it feminine.
Right. Well, again, so with my daughters, I want them to be strong. I just recently framed and put at the top of the stairs going to their bedrooms. It's actually, so we have boxer dogs, but I've seen recent ones. I've seen this in a version with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and it's like 4. I forget what it was, it's about being humble, being whatever, but the last one is being a badass, right? And so, I want my daughters to have that real strength, that sort of, badassery, as it were, right? That they don't need others, that there is that they are strong on their own. And that's more typical of boys, where we don't need to send that message to boys. boys, because that's sort of implicit in the messaging, right? The cultural messaging. But missing from that seems to be the idea of being able to be vulnerable, which strikes me as something that's universally important, right? But to be vulnerable as a male is some sort of weakness, right? And I suppose, I don't know if you've gotten any pushback, or, I mean, it makes reasonable sense to think about from an evolutionary standpoint of there is some value to that, a sort of assertiveness or lack of vulnerability, that strength or something like that.
Well, I think the problem is when we make it out as if strength and vulnerability are opposed to one another. Like, you can't embody both at the same time, and you can. In fact, and men that I met who work with boys, I'm thinking of one man in particular in Chicago, who works with middle and high school boys. One of his main messages for boys is you can be, hard. You can be strong and also soft. You don't have to sort of, be strong, and that means you are never vulnerable or never share how you truly feel. So I think girls don't get that message that being strong means you can't cry, for example. I think girls know that you can do both, and that's what I think would be more healthy for our sons. And I think, even if we think we don't carry around some of those stereotypes, they're really strong. They've been given to all of us throughout our lives. And so, like, one really interesting study that I wrote about was mothers took their babies, their 11-month-old babies, into this lab for a study, and there was a ramp, and they predicted how steep a ramp their babies could crawl down. And mothers of girls tended to underestimate how there was no difference in the end. These babies, according to their sex, there was no difference in the steepness of the ramp. But mothers of girls tended to underestimate their child's abilities, while mothers of boys overestimated their child's abilities, thought that they would do better. So even when, we think some of this stuff is just in us, and we don't even know that we are believing it. When we're dealing with our kids.
Yeah, it's a strange thing. One of the things I used to say, and I still believe, is, and I think you referenced it a little bit in the book at one point, when I was coaching girls, one of the things that struck me is that girls had the opportunity in sports and in some other places, but especially in sports, to sort of be to display or exhibit some of that toughness and that sort of, I think you may have put it in terms of, being a tomboy, right? That maybe are less associated with femininity, that kind of thing, whether that's true or not. But sort of culturally, that's kind of the way we sometimes think about it. But then can go and clean up and be very feminine and do all the sort of prettiness or whatever, right? Whereas boys, they don't have that latitude. They certainly have some. We certainly have some opportunities and privilege in some ways that girls don't as well. But it struck me as an interesting way to think about sports, and one of the things you talk about sort of leveraging sports, and I do think that's an interesting way to think about or contextualize the sort of masculinity, sometimes the hyper-masculinity of boys in sports versus the opportunities to grow. And I guess maybe kind of, if you could kind of talk a little bit about some of those pieces that you wrote about, if you would.
Well, one thing that comes to mind. So yeah, we don't have a positive, tomboy is a generally positive word for girls. It's a strong girl, right? We don't have a positive word for boys who act girlish. We only have negative words for that. Right. Sissy or something, So why is that? That's like, we just don't encourage boys to act girlish. That's an insult, not a positive thing. Right. And that is true. What's really interesting to me is that is true not only in our country, but around the world, in terms of these really strong stereotypes that both boys and girls face. But so there's researchers at Johns Hopkins who have found, in interviewing children on 5 continents, 10 to 14-year-olds, that girls, there's sort of this global script around girls are supposed to be pretty and submissive, boys are supposed to be tough and dominant. but those kinds of strictures are really loosening for girls in a way that they are not for boys. So that, the stereotypes are really strong for boys. And in terms of sports, I mean, I think one thing that was really hopeful for me was to learn about this program called Coaching Boys into Men. So I learned about it from a young man named Julian, who was in college when I met him, but he had gone to his high school football coach when he was a senior. And he had said, look, I am so sick of the misogynistic language in our locker room. I am so sick of my teammates, asking me about my own sexual life. Like, can you help? Can you do something about this? And to his coach's credit, he did. He started doing this thing. It's 15 minutes a week talking to players about respect and dignity and consent and dating relationships. And this is a program that has been found to boys who go through it are less likely to commit dating violence and less likely to stand by or laugh when they see someone else be abusive. So it's been shown to work, but Julian gave it this powerful testimonial where he said it really did change the way boys not only dealt with the girls in their lives and the girls in their school hallways, but the way they dealt with one another. They were just nicer to each other. And the upperclassmen, were nicer to the freshmen and didn't make their lives so hard on the team. And as Julian said, he's like, I don't think it's the only reason we made it to the playoffs that year after lots of losing seasons. But he did think it had something to do with the winning, that the stronger team culture had translated on the field. So, what's hopeful to me about that is there are boys, and I think most boys, who really want a different kind of culture in their locker rooms, and that it's possible to create it, and it doesn't require overturning the earth. It's just 15 minutes a week of a coach who's sort of dedicated to making that part of his job. So I think the same can be true in classrooms and in schools. That schools that are really committed to making cultures that are kind and empathetic that there are real different. I mean, your audience knows this because they work in schools. There are huge differences between different schools when it comes to their commitment to the culture, and so we can make a difference by making sure we are working on cultures where respect is the norm.
Yeah. So I wonder how you think about, or some of the people that you talk to, especially like in those kinds of programs, think about what seems to me to be a bit of a tricky balance. I'm a male, and I go out and play golf with my buddies, and there are times when we may use language or talk about things that certainly not Donald Trump level kinds of language, but there seems to me to be some place for that, right? And women do, as I'm told, some versions of that, sort of joking around, that kind of thing. So how do you think about those kinds of balances where maybe not boys will be boys, kind of to that extent, but that is there a role for, or is there a place, or how do we think about those kinds of conversations that are maybe joking in manner? I'm not even sure how to articulate it quite right.
Well, this is an interesting question, and one that I wrote about in terms of a tension between two different approaches to talking with boys about sexual harassment and sexual violence. Mm-hmm. So one approach, which in the book is embodied by a program called Mentors in Violence Prevention, that's been used with athletes and military and professional athletes. And that approach is, you talk about toxic masculinity, and you talk about rape culture, and talk about misogynistic language as unacceptable because it is demeaning and dehumanizing to women, and that it, sort of that kind of misogynistic language is at the bottom of a pyramid, at the top of which is rape. And so that there's sort of like this progression, and you have to attack the problem of sexual violence by attacking some of the attitudes that underlie the language. Another approach is embodied in the book by this program called Green Dot, which is all over college campuses and high schools all over this country, where they very intentionally do not talk about things like toxic masculinity or rape culture. They don't talk about these sort of cultural things that can be hard for boys or men to swallow. They instead just talk about, what do you do? What does it look like when you see an abusive situation unfolding before you, and what can you do about it? How do you step in? What are strategies? So, that these are really the Green Dot has a lot of data behind it that shows that it works. MVP has been around a long time, has never had the studies done on it that shows in the same way with the same body of data that it works. But these are two really different ways to approach the problem of sexual violence against women. And I think, people feel very strongly about one versus the other. In the book, I don't take sides. I sort of present these two different ways of talking with boys about this issue. But the leader of Green Dot, which is the one that doesn't really get into to the cultural stuff, says, she's a woman and she's worked for a long time in rape prevention, and she just feels like it's too much to ask in some ways, to ask boys to give up, to go from 0 to 60, to sort of like completely rethink the culture that they've grown up in. And that it makes more sense to sort of give them actionable things to do to interrupt abuse. And that if you can make a difference that way, then it's worth it.
Yeah, well, I guess that kind of gets to, or maybe a good segue into some of the consent pieces. And that's really tricky, right? As you mentioned, so the oversimplified slogan of no means no and yes means yes, right? And, we all navigate this as we get into romantic relationships and dating and the courtship, right? If you're dating, you're pursuing somebody, you are, ostensibly trying to navigate that in a way, but, the romanticism of saying, okay, is it okay if I kiss you? Is it okay if I touch you? Like, well, one might be able to put that into a romantic context. It's a little difficult, right? Like, thinking about how you navigate that from a boy's perspective, from a male perspective, in ways that is respectful, but also, is not, gives them the opportunity, gives actually both parties the opportunity to sort of engage in some of those courtship kinds of activities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that, so let's start with the oversimplification. We tell the schools I visited for this book, and many of them, they were teaching consent either with no means no or yes means yes. And that's not actually how we communicate, right? So I think that, or they were teaching it through what is in the law around what is consent in the law, and how do you know if you've broken the law? And I think what's tricky about that is, it ignores the way we actually communicate in real life. So, people who feel uncomfortable in a social situation or a sexual situation don't usually like scream no and then run out of the room because we want to be, especially if you like somebody, you want to keep, want to keep it cool. You want to keep the line of communication open. So you might try a different way to tell somebody that you are uncomfortable. Or if there's like a huge power differential, you might not say you're uncomfortable at all. So yeah, I think we have to talk about body language. We have to talk about power and how, if you are the person who feels like, if you are a girl who likes this older boy much more than he seems to like you, you might not feel like you can say no. But these are not things we usually talk about, I think, when we teach consent. And so then we leave boys with this impression that they're going to hear like a screamed no, and that's going to be the signpost. In fact, there's research from Brown University that shows that boys literally, believe that they will, when they hear a no, they will stop. And if they don't hear a no, they won't stop. Whereas girls in that same study say, well, sometimes if I'm not saying anything, I'm consenting, but sometimes if I'm not saying anything, this is not something I want, and I just don't know how to verbalize it. So I'm using body language. I'm trying to pull away. So yeah, we have to have much more fulsome conversations about consent and about what it looks like when somebody's uncomfortable. And
Right.
boys are perfectly capable of reading discomfort. It's not like boys are broken in some way where they don't know if somebody else is feeling uncomfortable. They do. It's just that we've given them this rule that, like, well, if she really doesn't want it, she'll say no. And in fact, let me just say one other thing about this. Boys also tell me, one young man told me, well, we're taught no means no. And so that means we have to get her to say yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned that in the book.
Yeah. I mean, that's, that has to do with this sort of myth that we teach that girls will always play coy and they'll say no first until they, finally give in and say yes. So we have to get past that and make sure boys know that, if they do hear a no, or if they even suspect that someone's uncomfortable, if they're not sure, they should just treat it as a no and let their partner take the lead.
Yeah, and so there's so thinking about the dating world and thinking about how that plays out, that it's just really tricky for adults and for adolescents, right, who are probably less equipped to be able to think through the complexity of that. And sort of the fear of, and I think you mentioned it. So you talk about the Aziz Ansari case as being one that I was vaguely familiar with. I'd seen his special comedy that he had done after his sort of big controversy. I wasn't aware of the details of it, at least the ones that you had described, of this young woman being in this position and actually performing oral sex on him as a way to sort of bridge the gap between her discomfort and his, pursuit or something like that. And there is, though, there is a very real fear. I experience it. So I'm divorced and, I'm dating and I have experienced my default is to say, hey, this is in your hands, right? Like I'm gonna follow your lead. But then again, I've dated women who might have said, or who have said, or implicitly expressed, like, I want somebody who's going to take the lead, right? So there's a tension there that I can imagine an adolescent would really find to be a difficult landscape to navigate.
I think that's that tension between that boys feel around not wanting to violate anyone's boundaries, but also feeling like it's their job to take the lead, is one that I did hear from boys. Mm-hmm. And that is part of this sort of larger tension, I think, around boys being asked to consider new ways to conceive of masculinity at the same time that they're getting a lot of messages that they should be doing masculinity in the way that men have always done masculinity. So it's a tricky time. It's a tricky time to be a boy. I mean, in the Aziz Ansari case, I went through all the ways in which this young woman, so he was a famous guy, a famous wealthy man. She was a much younger, not famous girl, young woman right out of college. Went through all the ways in which she sort of tried to verbalize and use body language to show her discomfort. She didn't, it's not as if she didn't make her discomfort known, but he, as you said, kept pursuing. And then it ended in this way that other researchers and writers have written about as well, where a woman will just say, okay, fine. And give oral sex as sort of a way to get out of the situation, that it wasn't a sign of consenting, but a sign of sort of giving in. So I think, it doesn't take I think our message to boys is you can still take the lead, but you have to be sensitive to to what you're hearing from your partner. The goal is not to get to yes. The goal is to listen to what your partner's saying, whether she or he is speaking verbally or using body language. And if you're not sure, then the answer is no. Like that, and if that means that person that you end up breaking up with, or, you end up not getting together with somebody who wanted you to be more aggressive, but it also means that you didn't force somebody into doing something or coerce somebody into doing something they didn't want to do. I mean, for me as a mom, and when I'm talking to my son, that is a trade-off worth making.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me too as one of the ways in which we might frame sexual acts as sort of conquest and gratification for oneself versus the sort of connection and intimacy between two people, right? So if it's the latter, then it seems to be much easier. It would seem to me intuitively to be much easier to continue to think about those boundaries and that as a conversation, because there's a real joy in that intimacy between two people versus the former, which is, getting her to say yes or getting what I want, right?
Yeah, if you just want to get what you want, then you should masturbate. Like that's what. But so that's a different thing than being with another person who has self-determination over their own body. Like once another person is part of your equation, you do not get to get what you want. You have to listen to what the other person wants, and that's just like that has to be part of what we talk about with children from the time they're small, and not around sex, but like, around sharing cookies or around, whatever. You can talk about what it means to be with another person and listen to and respect another person in a lot of ways before kids are ready to talk about sexual relationships, so that by the time you get to talking about sexual relationships, it's not like mind-blowing that you can't be completely selfish.
Right. Are there any indicators that you found or uncovered that might, I guess, where you say, let's say right-leaning or more conservative or Christian or atheist or whatever those sort of demographic indicators might be that might indicate or be associated with pushback on kind of the research or some of the ways in which boys, like you're wussifying boys with this idea, this kind of thing, and toxic masculinity being the sort of trigger for those kinds of people. Is it conservative Christian right leaning that is pushing back on that more so?
There is evidence from this survey by Pew Research that shows that ideas about masculinity are linked to, or do sort of correspond to, or differ around your political beliefs, and that Republicans are more likely to say it's a good thing that society values masculinity, and than Democrats are, for example. And there's a ton, like I ran into just a ton of examples of pushback to the idea of broadening masculinity. So when Target eliminated its labeling for boys and girls toys in 2015, there's a huge backlash. And, a lot of the people who commented on that on social media talked about what God intended for boys and girls, that God intended boys and girls to be, created them differently, and that we should not try to pretend that those differences don't exist. And I think, I wrote a bit about the sort of this nature nurture debate, and of course we are built out of our biological bodies, and boys, I think one of the really interesting things I learned was that in utero, there's sort of this flood of testosterone when a baby is in order to create male genitals, there's a flood of testosterone in utero, and that flood of testosterone then is linked to, for example, different play preferences. When a child is when a boy is really interested, boys are more interested in different kinds of play on average than girls are. But I also learned that even when there are some small average differences between boys and girls, the variation among boys is so large and the variation among girls is so large that basically my takeaway was when your baby's born and it has a certain set of genitals, you just don't know who that person is going to end up being,
Right.
what they're going to end up loving, what they're going to end up being really into. And so, we kind of owe it to our kids to not prejudge who we think they're going to be based on their sex.
Yeah, so I used to teach psychology, and one of the things that you mentioned in the book and you explored, and I'd be interested to have you share it with the audience is, and I used to talk about the sort of spectrum. I think you used that word in the book as well, sort of more masculine, more feminine, and that we all sort of fall along that spectrum. But then as I'm remembering, that you also added some other sort of languages or dimensions around the thinking between those, right?
Yeah, I think at the end of the book, I wrote about this idea that was brought to the fore decades ago by a woman named Sandra Bem, that people who are quote unquote androgynous, meaning they have qualities that we are traditionally associated with feminine and traditionally associated with masculine, are that's what she called androgyny. And others have written about how and done research on folks who fall into those categories being sort of more creative, more emotionally healthy or well-adjusted, things like that. So is that what you're talking about? Sort of the idea that we can have access to different parts of that spectrum, no matter who we are?
Yeah, I guess in a simple sense, yeah. So I used to try to, I was teaching, I still live in Kentucky, so quite a bit of sort of high school simplistic thinking about that it's a binary in a very clear, like you are either boy or girl in your behavior, your preferences, what you are interested in, your what's okay, which seems to be, the evidence is obvious that that's not exactly clear, right? That I might be more masculine than some other people, some other boys. I may be less masculine than some other boys in the ways that I sort of, the amount of testosterone, or even the behaviors and things that I might engage in. And I guess masculine and feminine in that sense is at least somewhat of a social construct. I'm not an expert in that, but that, that there is a very, it's a complex, nuanced sort of the ways in which we should be thinking about it is complex and nuanced. There are girls who might be more masculine than some boys, and that especially in how they might sort of behave and act. And again, that's a sort of social construct kinds of activities, because those are boy activities, those are girl activities, and we like I said, we have two girls, and there's no sense of like boy toys and girl toys. Like there's toys, and if they want those toys, then play with those toys, or those, so I don't know if that clears up, or just sort of word salad at this point.
I think the younger generation, so Gen Z, is much more sort of comfortable. Surveys have shown there are many more Gen Z members understand gender to be a spectrum, as you were talking about, and not a binary choice between boy and girl or male and female. And more young people are identifying as non-binary. So I think, in addition to sort of young people seeing gender as a social construct, seeing masculine and feminine as ideas that we have about, the truck is for boys and the doll is for girls, as being just an idea and not how it has to be. That there is also sort of a growing number of young people who identify as gender non-conforming or non-binary. But I think too that all of that really depends on where you grow up and on your community and your family. Overall in our country, there is that move, and there is also a move towards accepting LGBT people, and at the same time, there are also places in this country where boys grow up and they get very traditional messages about what it means to be a boy, and very traditional traditional homophobic messages that it is not okay to be gay.
Right.
So I think it's we are polarized around so many lines in this country, and this is one of them.
Right. Yeah. So maybe to put a bow tie on this. So again, I was teaching psychology here in Kentucky in a fairly rural, conservative Christian community, and it always struck me, one of the things in Louisville, we're just outside of Louisville, Kentucky, and there was at the time, I don't know if it's still there, a nightclub downtown Louisville that was, essentially a gay club, LGBTQ, something, some club with that kind of a sort of theme, right? And I would, just to challenge their thinking, I would raise questions about, what would you go there? And of course, the males were either through conditioning or through signaling or something would say, no way, I wouldn't go down there because I wouldn't want some gay guy to hit on me, which was, I always found it to be really interesting. Like, first of all, that you thought you were going to get hit on, you thought that you were worthy of getting hit on, but then what's the problem with that? Like, you don't have to cooperate, and if you choose to cooperate and reciprocate or whatever, then fine. But girls are getting hit on regularly by all kinds of unwanted suitors, and they don't. I don't know. So it just was always something to raise as a piece to challenge what they either thought was right or what they thought was supposed to be right. And I think that gets to some of the pieces in your book. So so you have some language in here and a question, or some chapters and some of your writing around the trauma and how it's linked to violence, especially in the context of Black boys, Black men. So kind of give us a little bit of your thinking in that respect.
Yeah, I visited a middle school in Chicago for this particular chapter. It was one of the schools I visited for this chapter. Where I get to sit with a group of boys who are in a program called Becoming a Man, where they meet each week and talk to one another and to their counselor. And they share really deeply about the things that are going on for them. What I learned from being in that group was that the boys were not used to talking about, or they weren't as comfortable talking to me about sort of what kinds of issues they had faced because they were boys. Gender it wasn't as easy for them to see as race and racism. I mean, they were just so conscious of the racism and sort of racial stereotypes that they were up against in their lives. One boy brought up Emmett Till and said he thought that that the world still sees Black boys like him, like the world saw Emmett Till, meaning the world still sees Black boys as sort of dangerous or predatory. And so I think, boys are really these boys were so conscious of these messages. And I think, we see the impact of those messages from early on. I mean, Black children in preschool are suspended more than 3 times as often as white children. And there are disparities like that continue on through their schooling life. So it was heartbreaking and important for me to learn that these boys felt that from the time they were really young and were grappling with what it meant for them in their lives.
Yeah, some interesting pieces around the sort of enculturation and the messages that they receive, for sure. And there's also, it seems like a connection here too, although maybe loose, especially with young boys and Black men, around pornography. And I know you mentioned some of that in the book, but it's there's certainly an element of Black males and the sort of phenomena of that in pornography, as well as the majority of pornography being more sort of from the male perspective, which is very likely, I think you mentioned, and I've seen in other places, really putting a pressure on what boys might think of as what sex looks like, what it should look like. When I taught in California many years ago in the late 90s, it's funny, I had a colleague whose sister was, what's the name of anyway, she made pornography at that point from a female perspective, which is, I think maybe a little bit more prevalent now, but it is apparently very different from most of what you might see on, Pornhub or one of the major outlets.
Yeah, I think that this is an important point you bring up and is relevant to schools in that, and as I said, I've been a teacher. I reported on education for most of my life as a reporter and did not know until I became acquainted with this sort of obscure CDC data that sex education has really evaporated out of many public schools over the last 2 decades, starting right around the time No Child Left Behind was passed. So we don't really know why this has happened. Perhaps it's because we have focused on reading, writing, and math.
It's not on account
of other things.
It's awful hard to test for sex education in the accountability system, right?
Yes, right, right. But and it's not just like social hot buttons that have disappeared. That it's not like, I don't think it's a consequence of schools not wanting to touch socially sort of controversial topics, because it's subjects like puberty, like what happens to your body when you go through puberty, which is, something kids need to know. So right. I think, so there's this sort of vacuum in the school side for a lot of kids. There is also a vacuum on the parent side for a lot of kids. There's research showing that a lot of parents don't talk to their kids about sex, about consensual relationships or respectful relationships. So what fills that vacuum? Well, a lot of times pornography. And, I talked to one boy who was in high school when I met him. He had been watching porn since 5th grade because his friends had told him to go check out Pornhub. And he said, I watched all that and I just figured, if you want to have sex, you just go get it. You don't ask. So that was the message he had taken. And if it's not hard to see how you'd get that message from a lot of online porn, because a lot of it is not respectful, not consensual. Some of it is violent. It's really easy to stumble on violent porn in some of those sort of clearinghouse sites. So that is not good for the formation of ideas about how sex works. But the really good news is we can do something about it. I mean, we can do something about it by talking to young people about the difference between pornography and real sex, about the need for consent. And that's not just something I am saying because I believe it. It's shown in research that, if adults are talking to young people about these issues, it sort of counteracts the effects of the pornography. So, I don't know, there's private schools that definitely are moving more into the space of talking to children more about pornography. But I wrote in the book about a public school nurse in Ohio who became convinced, after being in this healthcare provider role for young people in her school district, that they needed to start hearing about porn much earlier. So they're in this one district in Ohio, they're talking to children in 6th grade about pornography, because that's right around the time when a lot of kids start seeing it, whether on purpose or accidentally, to help them understand the difference. They don't talk in really explicit terms, but they talk about, what do you do if you see it? What are the messages we get from other media about sex and about relationships that aren't true, so that they can start thinking about this idea that you get impressions from what you see that might not be reality.
Right. So it's interesting as well to me to think about and perhaps this is relevant here, to think about the roles which parents and same sex versus opposite sex, right? So I have daughters. They are experiencing things that I have never and will never experience, right, with their bodies as they're entering and have entered puberty. And to me, I don't particularly think about those things as being taboo or things that we shouldn't talk about. To them, that's a different story, right? Whether that's something that they think that they should be talking with me about, or that their mother should be. And so I'm curious curious how you think about this. You've got some time before, you've got a 3-year-old boy, and, as he gets into puberty, you've got, 10 years or so. But it is an interesting, I asked my mom, like, how did that go with your dad? And I've even noticed, at this point, my daughters both, who I used to, at night we'd read and I'd lay down in bed with them and, kind of ease them into sleep and, for a few moments. And at this point, they're like, okay, just go, right? They don't need me to do that, nor do they want to talk about any of those sort of feminine kinds of issues. And is there a role that we should be thinking about, or how do you think about those sort of the blurring of those lines as parents and roles and genders and sexes and the surrounding issues?
I think it's important for boys and girls to know that bodies and sex are things you can talk about across with people, with not only people who are the same sex or gender as you, but people who aren't. And so that can happen in different ways. Like, I think one way it can happen is in schools. When I was in 4th grade, which was when we learned about puberty, starting in 4th or 5th grade, they separated us. So all the girls went in one room and all the boys went in the other. Girls learned about periods and boys didn't, and I think one thing we can do is stop segregating kids that way, so that they understand that, we all need to know about one another's bodies. Because it's important, if you're going to have a daughter, or you're going to be married to a woman, or you're going to have women in your life, like, you should know how their bodies work. Right. It shouldn't be a mystery or some sort of feel like a secret, magical thing. It's not. It's just how bodies work. So I think that's another way that's one way you can have those conversations, and make clear that this is not, there's nothing particular, there's nothing embarrassing about, sort of understanding how bodies work. I mean, also when we're talking with our kids about consent, like, communicating about what you want and don't want in a sexual relationship involves, if you're in a heterosexual relationship, involves talking to somebody who is, not your same sex, about your body, about what you do and don't want. So I think the more we can normalize that, the better for kids, and the more comfortable they might be when they get to the point of having, of needing to communicate.
Right, and I think it gets to, and one of the things we try to do here, I try to do on this podcast, is have those difficult conversations, because the more we do that, whether it's about sexuality or racism or whatever the case may be, that doing that and building the tools by which we can do that reasonably and thoughtfully, and that sort of exposure gives you an opportunity to then have more of them because you're used to it. But that is something, just as a side note, I think our schools have not done a particularly good job of over the last several decades, is fostering those kinds of conversations, whether they're about sexuality or not, and apparently not, especially not about sexuality. Yeah, so I think that's a real sort of lost art as we're really sort of retreating to our tribes, retreating to our identities, and those kinds of things, which strikes me as odd. As we think about schools, and I'll maybe sort of bring this back to schools as we're wrapping up here, thinking about the roles of school and the ways in which we can engage people in what we think about. Everything we do is through the lens of inquiry, so that the important questions to be asking and considering, one of the things is about acceptance and being, I think one of the quotes that stood out to me, this is a quote from somebody that you had in the book. I just wanted to be accepted. I really wanted to, feel cool. I wanted to have friends. I was just looking for some sense of comfort. And that sort of insecurity that leads people to act and behave in ways that rationally they might look back and say, yeah, that was a bad thing to do, is something that I think we can really focus on in and outside of schools, and giving people the ability, or building in people the capacity of being emotionally healthy, secure, have that emotional intelligence, not just school intelligence and knowledge and content, which is important and probably the primary piece of schooling. But I guess, can you give us a wrap up, kind of thinking about how you think about schools and what the role of schools might be in sort of furthering this conversation?
Yeah, well, as I said before, I think that there's a diversity among schools about how much energy and training and thought is put into the culture of the school, and making it a safe place for everybody. And so I think, one thing schools can do is that. And what does that mean? Well, one thing is it means training. I mean, I think there's a lot of sexual harassment, for example, in schools that is often driven by boys performing for one another, trying to just prove to one another that they are really masculine, that they are really cool. But it's also, boys are themselves recipients of sexual harassment, sometimes from other boys, sometimes from girls. But a lot of it just goes unaddressed in schools. And I think in talking with people who study this, that's often because teachers don't get the training that they need to know how to effectively respond. So I think that that's one thing that we can do. But starting, sort of going back to where we can start. I mean, I got the privilege of sitting in on two fourth grade teachers, incredible classrooms, and they had put social emotional learning really at the center of everything they did. And social emotional learning, as your listeners know, is such a buzzword, can be done really poorly and sort of, as a 15-minute thing that you sort of slap on at the end of the day on Friday.
It's SEL time.
Yeah. But these teachers did it differently. They really wove it into everything they had done. And I could tell from watching and also from talking to the kids that it was powerful for these kids who were they would say things to me like, I've learned how to manage my emotions. And I saw a kid almost lose it and walk out of the room. He was a boy, walk out of the room, and he came back in and calmly hugged his teacher. He told me he had gone outside to breathe and that he had been really angry and he had learned how to deal with his anger. So I think, and this is a group of kids who have the language to talk about empathy, to talk about supporting one another and problem solving when you're having an issue with someone. I mean, they just had so much language that so many adults don't have to talk about what it means to create a place where everybody feels safe and welcome. And so I think, that a lot of the conversation that we're talking about that can help kids is doesn't have to be about sex and sexuality directly,
right.
But can be about what does it mean to live in a community that respects one another. So that's what these teachers did so effectively that I was, I was really impressed by.
Yeah, that strikes me as a maybe a better way, and maybe better is not the sort of long-term and big picture more effective, just that mindset and approach of using that language and again, engaging in that inquiry and saying, I wonder how that person might feel, or what are the complexities and nuances of all of these kinds of situations, as opposed to getting into this sort of binary thinking and reductionism, that kind of thing. So Emma, I want to give you an opportunity to share any links. I know you've got the book and you've got Twitter profile, any places that folks might need to, in your estimation, find you and find your work.
Yeah, well, there is a website, toraiseaboy.com, and I am on Twitter at Emmers Brown, so EMMERS Brown, and I would love to see your listeners there.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the conversation. Certainly an important one, and it's an interesting book. I'd recommend folks get it. It certainly brings up some interesting points and will make you think and probably get you to ask some questions, which is always what we're after. So thanks so much, Emma.
Thanks for having me, Drew.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.